In this explainer, we're going to do something a little different. We're bypassing the kings, the grand castles, and the sweeping political events to uncover the true, sensory reality of everyday medieval survival. We aren't here to look at royal feasts. Instead, we're reconstructing an entire human world through the daily, lived experiences of ordinary people.
You know that famous quote, "The past is a foreign country, they do things differently there"? Well, we are going to treat the past as a living, breathing civilization. It's time to challenge that simplistic modern myth of the miserable, perpetually starving peasant. When you really look at it, you observe a world governed by incredibly intricate habits, constraints, and choices that shaped ordinary existence.
So, what actually fueled this medieval world? To deeply understand human history, we have to explore the peasant body as a literal energy system. We need to examine the immense thermodynamic and environmental constraints that shape their daily choices. Every single calorie was a tough negotiation with the land, the weather, and the social hierarchy.
Part 1. The Architecture of Survival. The Hearth and the Harvest. Let's just ground ourselves right in the physical environment where this daily struggle for sustenance actually unfolded.
I want you to imagine the intense sensory reality of a medieval home. It's before dawn, the village is already waking up, and this home, it was a working space just as much as a living space. The central hearth provided absolutely essential warmth and a place to cook, but it also constantly filled the small, often windowless interior with thick smoke, slowly blackening the walls. This was the true epicenter of their survival.
The preparation of food was just relentless. On one hand, you'd have the hearth, where a thick pottage bubbled away continuously. On the other, you'd have a communal baker hard at work, using a long-handled wooden paddle called a peel to slide these massive, coarse loaves into a dedicated oven. And those ovens were actually often pushed outside the town walls just because of the ever-present risk of fire.
Moving into Section 2, bread, ale, and pottage, the engines of caloric energy. Now we're going to break down the core caloric engines that transformed all that backbreaking agricultural labor into usable human energy.
Now, the absolute crucial point here is the number 1.5. A single medieval commoner could consume up to 1.5 kilograms, that's over 3 pounds, of coarse brown bread every single day. Sounds crazy, right? But they weren't eating this much out of gluttony, they were eating it just to survive the grueling physical demands of plowing, sowing, and harvesting.
You have to realize that class constraints dictated absolutely everything about nutrition. High society dined on refined wheat and freshly hunted game, genuinely fearing that raw vegetables were disease-ridden. The peasantry, however, relied on this sturdy plant and grain-based nutritional synergy. We're talking thick stews of peas and beans, known as pottage, supplemented by whatever seasonal greens and dairy they could scrape together.
Now, there is this massive modern misconception that medieval people literally never drank water because it was unsafe. Honestly, that's just a myth. These peasants exhibited incredible ecological ingenuity. They actively managed fresh water by channeling rainwater from roofs into barrels, boiling it, and relying on their senses to evaluate clarity and odor. By the late Middle Ages, cities like Bruges and Ypres even had advanced civic networks of lead and wooden pipes, drawing clean water straight from country ponds.
So you might be wondering, why all the ale then? Well, they weren't drinking weak ale simply to avoid water. They drank it steadily throughout the day because it provided vital carbohydrates. It was essentially liquid food. That hydration and those calories were absolutely required to maintain their grueling agricultural output from dawn until dusk.
That brings us to Section 3, Labor and the Sacred Calendar, a thermodynamic and spiritual balance. Because beyond sheer hunger, this diet was strictly governed by two unyielding forces: the thermodynamic demands of the soil and the spiritual laws of the church.
Think about intense seasonal tasks like harvesting or plowing. The body's demand for fuel just absolutely skyrocketed during these periods. A poorly fed worker tires quickly, which threatened everyone's survival. Because of this, manorial lords often provided extra rations like boiled meat and cheese during mandatory boon work, which was labor owed to the lord. They did this simply to keep their workers from collapsing in the fields.
And then you have the Christian calendar, which dictated a life of immense restriction. It told a peasant exactly when they could indulge and when they were forced into austere restraint. With up to 150 mandatory fast days a year, where meat was strictly forbidden, local economies and fishing trades were fundamentally altered just to supply the massive demand for salted fish. Religion wasn't just spiritual, it was quite literally on the plate.
Let's move to Section 4, Evidence from the Bones, Bioarchaeology and the Medical Reality. The incredible thing is, we don't just have to guess about these diets from old dusty texts. Modern academic scholarship allows us to read this history directly from the physical remains of the people themselves.
By synthesizing bioarchaeology and isotopic evidence, literally reading the chemical signatures left inside ancient bones, researchers can observe the brutal realities of this era firsthand. Dental pathology shows severe wear and tear on peasant teeth from the tiny pieces of stone grit left in coarse-ground bread. And through latrine bioarchaeology, we see the inescapable reality of parasitic infections like whipworm and roundworm, and those were prevalent even in wealthy, highly managed monasteries.
And when sickness from these diets, or those parasites, did strike, the medical response was deeply tied to what was known as the four humors. Physicians and commoners alike firmly believed that human health required a perfect balance of yellow bile, phlegm, black bile, and blood. Dietary choices, specific herbs, and bloodletting were all used to regulate this balance, under the belief that God had provided a natural cure in the environment for literally every affliction.
This leads us to Section 5, the edge of starvation, the fragility of medieval survival. Because despite all this ingenuity, everyday existence was incredibly fragile. We really have to examine that terrifying razor's edge, where routine's efficiency just collapsed into famine.
Early spring brought with it the terrifying reality known as the hunger gap. As winter dragged on and on, stored grain rotted and preserved foods ran out. Scurvy would set in from a total lack of vitamin C. So for these people, the arrival of stinging nettles, chickweed, or dandelions in the late spring wasn't some fun culinary preference. It was literal, life-saving medicine used to reverse the devastating effects of winter malnutrition.
In the absolute darkest times of harvest failure, survival meant eating the unthinkable. Peasants resorted to foraging for marsh cattail tubers, or eating mangelwurzel, which is a coarse root grown exclusively for livestock fodder. But even worse was the looming threat of St. Anthony's fire. This was a terrifying, hallucinogenic, and deadly illness caused by eating rye grain infected with the ergot fungus. The suffering was so profound that people genuinely believed the symptoms were a physical entry point to hell.
Ultimately, the big takeaway from this explainer is that the medieval diet was absolutely not some monotonous, ignorant tragedy. It's actually the exact opposite. It was an incredibly adaptive, thermodynamic system built by remarkably resilient people who maximized every single ounce of nutrition they could extract from the earth, all while navigating intense social and environmental constraints.
Which leaves us with a pretty profound question to chew on as we look back at their world. If our modern abundance, our fully stocked grocery stores, our climate-controlled refrigerators, if all of that vanished tomorrow, do we possess even a fraction of the physical endurance and ecological ingenuity that allowed our ancestors to survive, adapt, and build the very foundations of our modern world? Something to think about. Thank you so much for joining me on this journey into the past.